Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Very Cold Lasagna podcast. Now, before we get into this actual episode, full disclaimer, all my thoughts and opinions discussed in this episode will not be reflective of the upcoming NFL free agency period 2024. So, we'll be discussing more about these big moves that are happening within free agency within the first 2 weeks in the next two episodes. So, for now, sit back, relax. Let's discuss some more teams in our season recaps for the 2023 NFL season. So, let's get at it. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Very Cold Lasagna podcast, your place for all those filthy casual takes on the world of sports. I'm your host, DylanLasagna. This is episode number 189 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. And in this episode, we're here to continue our journey along NFL Season Recap Month 2023. And in part 2 of this month-long series here in March, we have 6 more teams to talk about here in Season Recap Month. And these 6 teams share a common theme: mediocrity and more disappointment in this second episode of our season recaps. So yeah, it's the annual tradition of mediocrity and disappointment in this land. So that's what we're here to talk about in our second parter of our NFL season recap month here on Very Cold Lasagna. Now, before we get into these next 6 teams here in these season recaps, I want to catch up on part 1 and some updates on that, as well as some feedback that we received from the first part of our NFL season recaps. So I found some feedbacks, especially from the clips. Some of it was good. Some of it was, it was I don't know, opinion, some other takes, which I appreciate. You know, it helps me. It sees, the light in me, I guess. I overlook some things as well. I'll be honest. I overlook a lot of things when trying to put all these shows together. So I appreciate the fact that people educate me. We're here to educate each other, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, that's why I'm a filthy casual fan. I mean, aren't we all? Some of us may be hardcore fans, like, oh, I'm a know-it-all, or I'm not. I might not be a know-it-all. But hey, at the end of the day, we're all fans, right? But anyway, some people were saying, oh, even though, like, for example, for the Patriots, I said that their season, especially the Bill Belichick era, ended on a dud. Well, I mean, it didn't matter in the end of the day, because, well, Bill Belichick still left as a 6-time Super Bowl champion head coach, which, yeah, I overlooked. I totally forgot about that because, I was looking at it from the perspective of this season. It was ingrained in my head, but I totally forgot to spit that out. Sometimes I forget that. And then for the Arizona Cardinals, there were some interesting comments, which I'll give them that. It's your opinion. That they had their own needs, which is good too. And then they tried to argue. I mean, not against it. Saying that Philadelphia was not an upset. They'll be 6-7 next 6 or 7 wins next year. I mean, we'll see. Anything can happen next year. Interesting stuff, and I'm all for it. I'm all for these interesting stuff. I'll see what you have to say. We'll see. And then you always can reply to me with what I had to say back to you. Hey, it's a never-ending cycle of, well, let's see what you got. So anyway, some updates from part 1. Some teams had some updates from the last time I talked about them. Including the Carolina Panthers. They actually franchise tagged their linebacker, Brian Burns. I mentioned how Brian Burns needs to be one of the priority people that the Panthers need to be signing long term. But I guess franchise tagging him was the only option that they can go, and especially at the deadline on Tuesday. So I don't know what's going on. Maybe they'll try to get a long-term deal done, or maybe they'll just play it this year through the franchise tag, which is a lot of money, and then we'll see what they'll revisit it next year. Meanwhile, for the Giants, they didn't use the franchise tag on either free agent Saquon Barkley and safety Xavier McKinney, so they're officially free agents. They're going to test out the market. I don't know if they're going to try to re-sign them, either one of them, but yeah, as of right now, Barkley and Xavier McKinney are free agents, free to sign elsewhere. Meanwhile, for the Patriots, they used the transition tag on safety Kyle Duggar. So I'm not too keen on the transition tag, but from what I read, it's basically Kyle Duggar can basically go and sign wherever, and the Patriots can basically try to match it. And whatever matching offer they have, they basically can keep Kyle Duggar, from what I assume. So they used that on Kyle Duggar. It was around I think $13 million from what I saw. And then for the Chargers, they released linebacker Eric Kendricks, their signing from last year, which is an interesting decision. But nonetheless, those are your updates from part 1 of our NFL season recaps. I think the biggest one that stands out the most is Brian Burns being franchise tagged, but I do think they need to get him signed long term, unless he demands an exorbitant amount of money. Then yeah, and you can let him go. But anyway, those are your updates. If you have any more for me, you can certainly let me know in the comments below on YouTube or send me a message on social media. Speaking of, let's get into some housekeeping before we get started. Good transition there. Follow me on social media on Twitter /X at Very Cold Lasagna, as well as Instagram at Very Cold Lasagna. And then if you're listening to this on audio, whether it be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you rate, review the show. Give it however many stars you want. And leave me some feedback on audio platforms as well. And for all my YouTube watchers out there, make sure you smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, leave a comment with your own takes on each and every episode that I talk about, as well as the various breakout clips that are being uploaded all throughout March for those of you that just want to see your particular team being talked about. So it's been going good so far in terms of the breakout clips. So some teams are being talked about. You have your own takes. I want to hear what you have to say about my filthy casual DA trying to talk about your team. But anyway, make sure you share this with your friends, share this with your family members, share this with a stranger, share this with your coworkers, share this with your colleagues in school, share this with whoever. Spread the good word of mouth or the bad word about my filthy casual DA in regards to Very Cold Lasagna. That being said, let's dive into our next set of teams with our 2023 NFL season recaps part 2. So kicking things off with part 2 of our 2023 NFL season recaps, as we now enter the land of mediocrity and disappointment, is a team that certainly felt like that a lot in this past season, and that was the Tennessee Titans. For the Tennessee Titans, following an injury-riddled season prior in 2022, to be honest, there wasn't a whole lot of expectations for these Titans to have a successful run in 2023, even in an AFC South that seemed primed for a rebuild, not just from the Titans, but also from, at least going into the season, from the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts, pretty much all the teams below the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, at least going in, looked like a team on the rise. Especially considering when you look at the Tennessee Titans. They kind of addressed their struggling defense from the year prior by adding the likes of cornerback Sean Murphy-Bunting from the Tampa Bay Bucks and linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair from the San Francisco 49ers. But then, even with those key additions to the defense, there's still that cloud of a potential last dance. And it kind of didn't feel like a good last dance either for both quarterback Ryan Tannehill and running back Derrick Henry, who was that key, those two key pieces in that 2019 Cinderella run to the AFC Championship game against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. So the potential of a last dance, if you want to consider that, for those two, it loomed very large because during the offseason of last year, there were loud trade talks surrounding those two. So you're going to a season, not a whole lot of expectations for the Titans, and, well, it certainly was solidified. It certainly was validated because when you look at what went wrong for this team, it was pretty much the entire offense, starting with the offensive line, because whoever was under center, whether it was Ryan Tannehill, Malik Willis, or eventually Will Levis under center, they barely had time to throw the ball, whether it was inside the pocket or out of it because they were forced out of the pocket. Their offensive line was a hot mess in pass protection. Run protection, or like running the ball, they were good because, well, Derrick Henry's still that good. But anyway, that's besides the point. They allowed a crap ton of pressure in pass protection, and they allowed their quarterback to get sacked a lot, which also resulted in Ryan Tannehill getting injured and Will Levis suffering an injury scare. Oh no, he actually also got injured at one point. So for Tennessee, it was a pretty bad year again in the offensive line. And if they really want to like take themselves a little bit more seriously in trying to keep their quarterback healthy, that's something they really need to fix next year, aka this fall. So continuing on with the offense, they really didn't produce a whole lot. It was already bad enough when the offensive line was a problem, but the offense as a whole was like really lacking in a lot of areas, especially in the receiving game, because DeAndre Hopkins was the only standout player. Coming over from the game from the Arizona Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins, he was the only guy that could establish a connection with whoever was at quarterback. But he's getting older. He's like in his 30s now. He's had his moments. The second or third year receiver, Treylon Burks, he's yet to be a consistent top guy that's still trying to replace A.J. Brown. And the Titans are still dealing with the after effects of that, making that really big mistake of trading away A.J. Brown. And in terms of the quarterback position, Ryan Tannehill, he conservative in his play. I mean, you're getting what you're getting with him at this point. And Derrick Henry, like I said, had a solid year. But again, the whole offense has still been over-reliant on him. So it was clear that the offense was still lacking that explosiveness. That was until Will Levis. Once Will Levis had to enter into the lineup, mainly because of Ryan Tannehill getting injured in that London game against the Baltimore Ravens. Actually, it was after that bye week when they came back from London. Will Levis, he actually looked pretty solid in the games that he played. Yeah, he made a lot of bad decisions, but I mean, expected from a rookie. It left a lot to be desired too. He opened up the offense a good amount. He made a lot of aggressive plays. Threw the ball, was a better deep ball passer. I mean, in fairness to Ryan Tannehill though. And he established a much better connection with DeAndre Hopkins. So overall, I mean, Will Levis' season, yeah, I mean, it wasn't like, he was like great and all that. I mean, I would say it's decent. So he will get a chance to prove himself this offseason in OTAs and training camp. That's if the Titans don't bring in another quarterback. So yeah, the Titans are considering that they're going through a full rebuilding phase this offseason. Will Levis, I think, is going to be able to get a chance to prove himself. And then when you look at another positive for this Titans season, it's the play of linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair. This is a really good pick. This ended up being a really good pickup for Tennessee, coming over from San Francisco in a 1-year prove-it deal. He proved that he can be pretty much a jet. Not the team, but he's flying all over the field, finishing with over 100 tackles, and he pretty much did well wherever you asked him to do. So Azeez Al-Shaair, wherever he goes next, whether it's staying in Tennessee or going to another team long term, you feel like, man, he could be a big producer for whichever defense needs him. And then you look at how the season ended for the Titans. Sure, they're going to a rebuilding phase, maybe a long one too. But you look at the way the season ended for Tennessee, they played their best for last. You get one last good performance out of Ryan Tannehill and Derrick Henry. They combine for 3 touchdowns. The defense pretty much harasses Trevor Lawrence all game long and that pretty much the entire Titans team put the hurt on the Jaguars in Week 18 to eliminate them from playoff contention and clinching the division. that's a pretty good way for the Titans. Yeah, a losing season overall, but it ends on a high note. Sure, they finished the season 6-11, but they go out on a high note. Unfortunately, you couldn't say the same about head coach Mike Vrabel, because surprisingly, they decided to fire him. I'm sure they didn't do too well in 2022, but a little surprising that they fired him despite all that's happened. And, well, expecting that they were going to do this well in 2023. So I guess they wanted a fresh start for this rebuild with former Bengals offensive coordinator Brian Callahan, who was key in the development of Joe Burrow and the Bengals offense in his time over there in Cincinnati. But he's going to have a big task at hand to start this rebuild. So going into the offseason for the Tennessee Titans, they at least have a really good foundation of starting this rebuild. They have around, at this time, $80 million in cap space. So they have a lot of money, to spend when the new league year starts. They have the 7th overall pick, so they have some flexibility on what they need. I'm not really too sure if they really want a quarterback, because you still have Will Levis and Malik Willis. I mean, let's be real here. I mean, no disrespect to him, but I mean, he's had his chances. So anyway, looking at some of the key free agents, linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, you might consider re-signing him. Edge rusher Denico Autry, corner Sean Murphy-Bunting, and running back Derrick Henry. I say the top 3 are your most pressing needs. I mean, it's pretty clear that Derrick Henry is ready to move on from the Titans. So looking at some of their needs to address once the new league year begins, I think it's pretty clear that you have to upgrade the offensive line if you're the Titans. Because as I noted, the pass protection the last 2 years has been god-awful. It's gotten Ryan Tannehill injured, and it's also gotten Will Levis injured. So they especially need a new left tackle, though. While they have to address both guard positions in order to get whoever's going to be quarterback injured. They have to prevent their quarterback from getting injured again. But that left tackle position, that blind spots for their quarterback, they have to go get a new starting left tackle. And then once you address the offensive line, you have to find some key areas for your defense. Find new cornerbacks, find a new safety, because it was like one of the worst in the league, getting torched very frequently, especially considering like when the pass rush didn't hit home, they were getting burned out there, like burnt toast when you overheat it. So if they don't plan on re-signing Sean Murphy-Bunting, they need to use both free agency and the draft to address those two positions, as well as the safety position, because of the Kevin Byard trade last year. By the way, Kevin Byard ended up getting released by the Eagles, so neither party won that. And then, last but not least, re-sign Azeez Al-Shaair and Denico Autry at their respective positions. So these are the two key free agents that Tennessee should be prioritizing to re-sign. They have a lot of money. Get it done. So overall, for the Titans, yeah, it was kind of an expected season where they weren't expected to succeed a whole lot, even in a kind of weak AFC South division. So they fired the head coach, Mike Vrabel. They're starting afresh with Brian Callahan, and whoever's going to be the starting quarterback, whether it be Will Levis, Malik Willis, or maybe even a new quarterback under center. But all I know is that they have a lot of key areas that they need to address coming soon once the new league year opens up. And I don't know if they're going to be really competing in 2024. But I will say is that they have to really take this offseason seriously if they really want to commit to a rebuild this coming year and beyond. So now let's go from the Music City down to the dirty south of Atlanta to talk about the Atlanta Falcons. For the Atlanta Falcons in 2023, well, they decided to put all their eggs into the Desmond Ridder basket. Pretty much why is that? Well, to recap, they drafted Desmond Ridder in the 3rd round of the 2022 NFL draft, but they only played him sparingly behind the starter veteran Marcus Mariota until the final 4 games of the 2022 campaign, where the Falcons were pretty much out of contention for the playoffs and, well, essentially the very weak NFC South. So they decided, you know what, we're going to play Desmond Ridder for these final 4 games, see what we can get out of him for next season, 2023. So that was why they decided to play him out. So Desmond Ridder got a full offseason's work in as a starting quarterback. But in terms of what they did prior to this past season, they did do a few things to go and get help for their quarterbacks, such as drafting standout college running back Bijan Robinson from Texas, and gain some insurance in case of an emergency in the form of Commanders quarterback Taylor Heinicke. So for Atlanta, there was a golden opportunity there to go and grab the NFC South this past season, especially considering there were other quarterback questions around the division from the Panthers, the Saints, the Bucks, even with their own quarterback questions with Desmond Ridder. But nonetheless, there was an opportunity there for Atlanta to go and grab the division in 2023. So in terms of what went right for this team this past season, you look at that defense. The defense needed upgrades last year after they got repeatedly burned, and that's actually 2 years of getting burned. And they were lacking still in a lot of key areas, especially in the pass rush. I feel like the secondary is where they were really benefited from last offseason. And one of those big signings that they had in last offseason was Bengals safety Jesse Bates, who was pretty much flying all over the field. And he was precise with over 80 tackles in the middle of the field and pretty much actually all over the field. And he led the team with 6 interceptions. So that signing of Jesse Bates to a kind of a big deal. So it paid off. It paid off for the Atlanta Falcons in the secondary. And when you look at the offensive side of the ball, Bijan Robinson with the 8th overall pick, he had a very solid rookie season. Even though many, including myself, questioned Atlanta's decision to use the 8th overall pick to draft him when they already had Tyler Algier, who broke out last year as a rookie, and Cordell Patterson, the veteran, who still is kind of effective for Atlanta when, those two running backs were already on the team. However, despite some oddities by his head coach, he made the most of his playing time with his explosiveness, his versatility, flexibility in both the rushing and receiving game. So it was a very solid season for the Texas Tech running back. But unfortunately, all of that was kind of undone by some oddities at the quarterback position. And, all those expectations set a little too high, I guess, by all of us. Maybe I set a little too high expectations for the quarterback myself. And, that ended up coming to fruition. Desmond Ridder pretty much disappointed for the Atlanta Falcons. Now, Desmond Ridder didn't start out too bad in the first 2 games when they started 2-0. But, man, starting from that game against the Lions in Week 3 going forward, it was going to start teetering on an alarming inconsistency. It wasn't a good sign for the Falcons when Ridder flipped between throwing good passes against some teams and then committing direct turnovers to other defenses, like throwing passes to directly to a safety, a linebacker, a corner, directly in their face, as well as allowing himself to hold onto the ball for too long to get sacked. So not a good sign for a quarterback in his first full season. And then Ridder was also lacking that ruthless aggression that good old Vinnie McMahon coined in the early 2000s of the WWE. Because, with Desmond Ridder, sure, he throws the deep passes at times, but it was very rare. He was a mostly very conservative quarterback that very rarely threw the deep ball, compared to Taylor Heinicke, who had to step in at times. Desmond Ridder did get benched at one point. He also got injured at one point. So compared to Taylor Heinicke, in his days with Washington, he rotated the starter duties with him in the back half of the season. But unfortunately for Heinicke, he only made things slightly better. But then when you get to the second problem with this offense, there's only so much you can do. So let's talk about the second problem with this offense. There's a lot of questionable usage with this team, especially when you consider the top weapons of this offense. Kyle Pitts, the tight end, Drake London, their top receiver, and then, like I said, with Bijan Robinson at running back. Arthur Smith really did some questionable things. Not in that way. He really didn't use them very well this season because he preferred to use the likes of Jonnu Smith over Kyle Pitts, the tight end. And then there were times where Desmond Ridder preferred to go with Mac Hollins over his top receiver, Drake London. And then, not to say that Tyler Algier was bad, because he actually did very solid throughout the year. It's just that Bijan Robinson's actually did a little bit better than Tyler Algier. And this is repeated times. Yet, when you put all those three in, I mean, not saying Tyler Algier was bad. It's just the offense overall was just very lacking. They couldn't do jack a lot of the times. So that's why the defense had to carry the load for the most part. And even that faltered at times. So it was pretty much more of the same stuff that we've seen in the last few years for the Atlanta Falcons. A staggering offense with a defense that has to carry the load way too much, and it eventually falters as well. And what do you get? The 7-10 record. The same 7-10 record that the Falcons have had for the last 2 years. So when you look at it for Atlanta, it was basically a rerun of the 2022 season for them. Same 7-10 record, same 8th overall draft pick, and same questions about what do you do at the quarterback position if you're Arthur Blank, the owner, and Terry Fontenot if you're the general manager. Well, when you look in terms of this season of the Atlanta Falcons, you just replace Marcus Mariota with Desmond Ridder at the starting quarterback spot, and then you replace Desmond Ridder with Taylor Heineke in the backup spot. Same shit. Now, they did fire Arthur Smith at head coach, rightfully so, and they replaced him with Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris. They did initially consider Bill Belichick during the hiring process. That could have been an interesting dynamic. Ironically, all that 28-3 stuff, and then you go on to hire the same head coach that embarrassed you in the Super Bowl with a humiliating comeback. But nonetheless, the Falcons now have to figure out what they're going to do at the game's most important position with a defensive coach. So looking at their offseason that's coming up, the Falcons have around $41 million to spend, which is it's a solid amount of money to go. And looking at their first round pick, same as the last year, 8th overall. Now for the Falcons, at least for them, they don't have to worry too much in terms of their pending free agents. The only one I would consider re-signing is Calais Campbell at edge rusher. Other than that, Jeff Okudah at corner and running back Cordell Patterson, I wouldn't worry so much about that. Now, in terms of their team needs that they need to address, you have to really consider the quarterback position as number one. Now, there have been heavy discussions about, which one do they get? Do they go trade for the likes of Justin Fields? Do they sign Kirk Cousins at free agent? Do they go and draft a quarterback at number 8, or do they trade up to go and get one of the top prospects in college? Well, either way, the Falcons have to go and get a whatever quarterback is best available for them. And once they address their quarterback position and the best available one that's out there, you gotta go address some help around that quarterback. Go and get some help for Drake London, because the Falcons are really lacking in the receiving game behind him and Kyle Pitts. This has been an ongoing issue for the last 2 years. So the Falcons really need to get some help aplenty in the passing game. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you need to sign and draft 2 edge rushers. Calais Campbell, big help in the very weak Atlanta defensive front. But they got to decide if they want to re-sign him. So use free agency and the draft to go and get 2 edge rushers, whether it's by re-signing Calais Campbell at one spot and then drafting another one, or getting 2 in free agency and the draft. So for the Falcons, they had a golden opportunity to win a very weak division in 2023, but they blew it all away because Desmond Ridder disappointed, whether by fault or not, and his head coach did him and his offense no favors whatsoever, and that got him fired. Now it's up to Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot to grab a long-term quarterback and refill key spots if they want to go and get Atlanta back where Arthur Smith wants them. And that is winning in the Dirty South. So now we go from the Dirty South of Atlanta, now moving forward to the Windy City of Chicago to talk about, actually, here's a soundbite of someone saying it better, a million times better than me, and that is Bears Football!
football!
So after playing their best Bears football in 2022 on their way to the top overall pick in the draft, the Chicago Bears spent their offseason trying to supplement themselves on both sides of the ball. And initially with moves such as linebacker Tremaine Edmonds and receiver DJ Moore, which they got in that trade to the Carolina Panthers, in that, like I said, trade from getting the number 1 overall pick to the Panthers in exchange for DJ Moore. I thought they had themselves a good offseason initially, and we're on track to a decent season. That was my preview thoughts when I talked about the Bears back in July of last year. Unfortunately, it's the same old saying of Bears football when you talk about them in the regular season, because everything that goes on in the preseason and in the offseason for the Bears, not exactly all that good translates into the regular season if you're Chicago. Because, well, when you look at what went wrong for the Bears in the regular season, it's pretty much all this offensive instability. Now, that's not to say that Justin Fields didn't exactly play poor compared to the previous years that he's been with the Bears for the last 2 years. In fact, he actually played a little bit better than his last 2. But when you look at him as a passer, which was my main number 1 goal for the Bears to hopefully see out of him, he had to be better as a passer, but he was very inconsistent at it. So when he needed to run, he would. He was a very good running quarterback. But when it came time to throw, when the Bears needed him to, especially when they were behind, it would become a two-way street of checking it down, throwing it big, and then making a bad turnover. So Fields did have some nice throws throughout the season, but many of them came against non-competitive teams. And then when he did make that big throw, he turned it over against good teams. So on top of that, with the Bears offense, the rest of the team was just very inconsistent as well. The rushing attack that featured Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, they had their moments too, but they would just sometimes also have a bad day as well. Sure, they were one of the top rushing teams in the NFL, but it's just like, yeah, if you don't balance that with a good passing attack, then you're gonna have a rough day, and it's gonna lead to some of those losses as well. So speaking of the passing attack, DJ Moore and tight end Cole Kmet were the only featured offense options in the passing game. With Darnell Mooney, that breakout receiver a few years ago, he no-showed. He no-showed in a contract year for this team. Woof. And then, of course, let's also not forget, good old offensive coordinator Luke Getsy's play calling, where he showed a lot of courage with his running backs running it for nowhere, and then have Justin Fields throw a check down on a 3-and-out to punt it or go for a field goal, or maybe even on a 4th down. That's when they decided to throw it, and then it goes nowhere. So in essence, the offense mostly didn't hold up its end of the bargain for a defense that actually did kind of well for itself, especially when we talk about them later on. And then the other thing that went wrong for the Chicago Bears this season, well, it was just more of the same Bears football bullshit that happened throughout the year. So even when they would have a good day, to start at least, their coach Matt Eberflus would just always seem to get in the way. Seemed to forget that he would have to finish the story in order to win the games. There are multiple instances throughout the season where the Bears would be up big, but then they would fall flat on their face and let their opponents come back and win the game. It happened with it happened with the Broncos. It happened with the Lions. It also happened with, I believe, the Browns as well. So it's a simple case of bad coaching and taking your foot off the gas pedal. Now, it's not to say that the rest of the team is at fault, because it is as well. But at the end of the day, it also comes back at your head coach. If you don't coach up your team well to finish these games, then that's on you. So it ended up costing the Bears a couple of wins throughout the season because they played Bears football late in games. But on a more positive note, though, for Chicago, looking back at their defense actually did pretty good for themselves in the second half of the season. And one of the main parts of that was making a midseason trade for Commanders defensive tackle Montez Sweat. And some people were honestly really questioning why they even made this trade in the first place. And then even handing him a big fat contract like before the season ended. But when you look at the Bears, during the season when they didn't have Montez Sweat, they were struggling pretty much everywhere and just about every facet for the first half of the season. But once they made that trade for Montez Sweat at the deadline, they took a sudden 180. Now, not everything was perfect, but they did better in the front four. They became a heavy pressure, a sack happy, a better front four that can get to the quarterback a lot better. And corner Jalen Johnson, he also played a lot better too. And the run defense also heavily improved as well with the play of Montez Sweat. So Sweat's play was rewarded with a big fat contract, like I said, but also a Pro Bowl and All-Pro nod as well. And so far, his play and his contract, it looks to have been earned for both himself and Chicago. And I'd say they decently ended the season. I mean, sure, it also had a losing record, so it's not great. But yeah, they also lost to the Packers again, where their lackluster offense shined again. But they ended the season 6-5, a kind of winning record. And honestly, it could have been much worse, a much worse trajectory than when they started the season at 1-5 and going downward. And if you look at it on a more positive light for Chicago, despite ending the season at 7-10, and where things really looked lost for the Bears after they started off 1-5, with an inconsistent offense, they made some improvements on both sides of the ball to end the season. Yeah, sure, you ended at 7-10, but it's also not a bad way to end the season when you have a good amount of resources heading into an important offseason, including 2 first-round picks at number 9, and especially number 1 overall, considering that you own that pick from the Panthers, who managed to stumble upon the worst record in the NFL. So for Bears fans, it's not all that bad. Really, it's not. So looking at their offseason for Chicago, you have around $79 million in cap space at this time. So that's a lot of money. Yeah. That you're going to be spending. That's if Ryan Poles gets off his high horse. Old King Coles is the merry old Poles. Gets off his high horse and actually spends that money. So in terms of their draft picks, their first round picks, like I said, they're going to be picking first overall, which courtesy of the Carolina Panthers, unless if they trade that pick, and 9th overall, their regular pick. Now, like I said, remember the big trade last year for the Bears. They gave away that pick to the Panthers in return of their first round pick this year. So looking at some of the key free agents, fortunately for them, not too many to note of. So like last year, they don't have to worry too much about their in-house free agents, like receiver Darnell Mooney and edge rusher Yannick Ngakoue. They did make a couple of moves already before the start of the new league year, like firing offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. So we unfortunately don't have to meme him about putting up courage, looking at all my halfback dives and all that. So they did replace him with former Seahawks offensive coordinator Shane Waldron. So let's see how that goes once the season starts. And they also released safety Eddie Jackson and guard Cody White here. A little old, little bit on the aging side, so maybe they want to get younger at those spots, but they do have to replace them. They also franchise tag corner Jalen Johnson, so I'll get to that in a bit. They also traded for Bills guard Ryan Bates in exchange for a 5th round pick. A little bit of an interesting decision that they trade for him now rather than wait a week. I think he was a free agent, but it'll be interesting that they didn't wait a week to do that. But now they lost a pick. And they only have, I believe, 5 picks in this draft. So unless they trade away one of their first-round picks, then I don't know why they did this move. So looking at some of their needs to address in this coming offseason, which starts very soon, they got to figure out what to do at the quarterback position. I mean, as I noted with a couple of the teams I talked about already, there's been this constant and conflicting rumblings on what the Bears are going to do with the top overall pick and their quarterback, Justin Fields. So it's going to be difficult what the Bears are going to do. They're kind of in this interesting position where they don't have a necessarily bad quarterback with Justin Fields, but they're also in a prime spot where they can get a top prospect at number 1 overall, that could potentially be that game changer for them in this time. So they have to decide, do they want to commit to Justin Fields, or do they want to restart with the golden opportunity that presents itself, whether that be Caleb Williams, Drake May, or maybe even someone else. So either way, the Bears are going to have to make a difficult but swift decision on whether to keep or delete Justin Fields and decide what to do at the quarterback position. Once they decide on the quarterback position, you got to get DJ Moore some help, because the Bears have absolutely no one around the receiver spot. Even if they were to re-sign Darnell Mooney, he had a very bad year. I don't even expect him to have another good year, but who knows? But either way, they got to consider using their normal 9th overall pick, barring they don't trade it, on using it on the second best receiver available in the draft. But before then, you got to find some more receivers in free agency. And then you got on the defensive side, you got to re-sign corner Jalen Johnson to a long-term deal. So Jalen Johnson was very good for them, only allowing under 200 yards in less than 30 catches while he was targeted. He only allowed 1 touchdown as well. This earned him All-Pro, Pro Bowl honors as well. So for Jalen Johnson, they got to sign him to a long-term deal. Get it done as soon as possible. So they should also consider signing some depth behind himself and corner Tyreek Stevenson, who also had a surprising rookie season. So for the Chicago Bears, it was a kind of down year for them. But this year, compared to last year, actually, that was a very down year. And this year was a slight improvement. But they should at least feel a little bit more hopeful. At least they should try to feel that things go up from here. So even with a taste full of riches to spend soon, they have some very interesting decisions that they got to make. And that starts with the quarterback position. That is, though, if their higher-ups, including Ryan Poles, are willing to do so. So now let's move on from the windy city of Chicago to talk about the greener side of New York, as we now talk about the New York Jets. The Jets, for feels like the longest time in forever, they had the biggest reasons of hope in 2023. And like I said, since forever, because after 2 struggling seasons of second overall pick in 2021, Zach Wilson, and of course, prior to that with Sam Darnold, since they drafted him in 2018, I believe, they go and make this big swing last offseason to go and get Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers at quarterback just before the NFL draft in 2023. So they go get their quarterback. Okay, that's great. They got Aaron Rodgers from the Packers, but they didn't do a whole lot to supply him with help because, well, they waited a long time. A month is a long time to get that deal done. So despite all that, there's finally reason for optimism within the gangrene side of New York, and there were actually Super Bowl aspirations for this team. Surprisingly, many people were expecting him to realistically win the division, steal it from the Buffalo Bills, and host a playoff game in MetLife. But unfortunately, not even 4 plays into the regular season, that came to reality. Because, 4 plays in that Monday night game against the Buffalo Bills, disaster immediately struck. Aaron Rodgers, he tore his Achilles on the curse that is MetLife Stadium turf on a non-contact play. And, the season was over for the New York Jets. Just 4 plays into this 2023 season. Now, whether you're a Jets fan or not, you knew then and there that pretty much all the hopes and dreams for that season was dead. It was dead and buried in that turf. So, sure, they won that game in overtime on that punt return against Buffalo. But from then on out, it was pretty much, you knew what was going to happen from there. The same old story at quarterback. Once Rodgers went down, it was right back to Zach Wilson. The troubled Zach Wilson that gave people fits for his constant struggles, his wild inconsistency. So for Zach Wilson, he went on to start 11 of the Jets' 16 remaining outings. And like I said, it wasn't all bad, but he was vastly inconsistent under center. As the team went 4-3, and then to start the year, and then he went on a 5-game losing streak. So he did end up getting benched after week 11, just before the the Black Friday game against the Miami Dolphins, for Trevor Siemian and Tim Boyle. And Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian actually did a lot worse than Zach Wilson. Like, just look at that Black Friday game against the Dolphins. And I don't know if it was Boyle or Trevor Siemian who threw a 90 to 100 yard pick six before halftime. That's embarrassing. So Zach Wilson ended up getting the job back once Tim Boyle got released. But Wilson didn't last long because not because of poor performance, but he actually got concussed in Miami in week 15. So that ended his season, unfortunately. So hopefully he's healthy now. But in retrospect, the quarterback room was once again a big mess. And that was all because, well, Aaron Rodgers got hurt. The season ended once Aaron Rodgers got hurt. So the only reason that they won the games that they did, though, was because, well, the same reason that they won the games a year ago. Their defense. The defense, once again, had to carry this team on its back. It was a front seven led by its linebackers Quincy Williams and Jermaine Johnson II, as well as defensive tackle Quinnen Williams. They were a force. Once again, a force in the trenches, and were one of the best in the league. And you look at that secondary, led by corner Sauce Gardner, who had a really good second year, was also very effective in holding its own. And that's all despite the inept play of the offense. That defense was like a top 10 in the NFL. And yeah, like I said, with a terrible offense that just really was awful. But the offense, it had one or two bright spots, like running back Breece Hall and receiver Garrett Wilson. They made the most of it. They made the most of the crappy play from their quarterback. Breece Hall, coming off an ACL injury in his rookie year last year, he pretty much was the workhorse of that offense with his burst of speed and ability to truck through defenders. He had a nice season for himself. 1,000 yards and 9 overall touchdowns. And then Garrett Wilson was pretty much the top receiver of the passing game with another 1,000-yard season. So, unfortunately, well, actually, before we get to the unfortunate part, let's say for the Jets, probably their best win of the season was against the Houston Texans at home in a blowout game in Week 14. Defense played lights out on C.J. Stroud and Zach Wilson. Meanwhile, he had one of the very few better games of his career, along with the rest of the offense. Now, onto the unfortunate part. The positives still don't outweigh the negatives. Because, like I said, for the third time, and probably the fourth time, Aaron Rodgers was lost 4 plays into this 2023 season. And they were met with the same 7-10 record that they had for the last year. Fortunately for the Jets, though, he committed to playing this upcoming season. And for Aaron Rodgers, he nearly made a miracle recovery from that Achilles tear, for as unrealistic as it would have been for him to come back and play when the Jets were already well out of playoff contention. But now at least he gets a full offseason to prepare to try and, stay healthy, barring that curse of a field that is MetLife. So, as for this past season, though, major disappointment for the Jets and a little bit of a rerun of 2022. So when you look at this offseason for the Jets, they don't have a lot of money to spend, around $22 million. So it's decent, but not a lot. They pick at 10th in the draft. So it's somewhere. It's somewhere in the draft that they can go and get their best available need. When you look at some of their free agents, some things to consider, like Bryce Hall and Justin Hardy at corner. The top need that they need to address in free agency is safety Jordan Whitehead. That's someone they should probably try to consider re-signing. And looking at some of their needs to address in the offseason as it gets underway, it's the offensive line. Like, you have to consider beefing up that offensive line, because all you have is center Joe Tippmann and guard Elijah Vera Tucker. That's all you have. So in order to better protect Aaron Rodgers from injury and even self-injury, they need to go and grab 2 new starting tackles and another guard in the NFL draft. So they need to go and beef up that line. And then staying on the offensive side of the ball, go and get another receiver to go alongside Garrett Wilson. Because the Jets have had absolutely nothing at that spot behind Garrett Wilson. So use free agency to go, and the draft, to go and find better options than, well, Aaron Rodgers' buddies, Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb. And then, well, what do you do with Zach Wilson? Are you going to let him go on his merry way? I mean, at least the Jets have given him a head start by letting him seek a trade. The question is, does anyone want him? That's the thing. I guess it just goes to show what a huge bust he has been with that second overall pick. So anyway, in terms of the Jets' 2023 season, well, it was dead. It was dead on arrival when Aaron Rodgers went down with that injury in Week 1. But it can come back stronger in the coming fall in 2024 if they can replenish Aaron Rodgers' supporting cast, despite the limited resources they have in terms of money and draft capital. But if they have a solid offseason, and if they come back healthier in 2024, I think the Jets could have a season that they didn't have in 2023. So now let's go from green to purple as we travel from New York to up north in Minnesota to take a look at the Minnesota Vikings. For the Minnesota Vikings in 2023, they look to shake off all that stress, all that fast heart rate that was the 2022 season, where all those close games was really in play when they won the NFC North. But unfortunately, that came back to haunt them in their first round exit at the hands of the New York Giants, where all that close game magic just ran out. So before the season started for them, they had salary cap issues, limited draft resources, but nonetheless, they used last year's offseason to fix the reason why they were in such situations, such as replacing Ed Donatel with Brian Flores as defensive coordinator, and then they went on to add the likes of corner Byron Murphy and an edge rusher's Marcus Davenport. So they did all of this in hopes of trying to make a deeper playoff run with a better defense on paper in the NFC playoffs, especially when there was more pressure than ever to get it done with Kirk Cousins at quarterback, who was entering the final year of his contract, and there were questions about whether the Vikings wanted to keep him around and give him a new deal after the season was over. So when you look at the Minnesota Vikings, things didn't get off to a good start for them. They actually had an inverse of how 2022 was going. Losing all their close games instead of winning them compared to how 2022 went. But when you look at how the season started for Minnesota, they started 1-4, and the main crux of it was the inability to take care of the ball on offense, whether it be from Kirk Cousins throwing turnovers or just, being careless with the ball, not holding it correctly, or from the likes of Alexander Madison, rookie Jordan Addison, or others also not taking care of the ball. It put them in serious deficits, or in the case of they were up big, it gave leads away. So they started at 1-4, but once they got that under control, that was when everybody started playing much better. That included Kirk Cousins, and they went from 1-4 to 3-4 before the mid-season point, and they looked like a solid wildcard contender. And that was during a point where they were missing top receiver Justin Jefferson, who actually missed a good amount of the season due to a hamstring injury. So they had a 3-game winning streak going after starting 1-4, and the Vikings were getting to a point, like I said, mid-season wildcard contender. And when you look at their their early season turnaround as they're starting 1-4, the defense started playing much better under Brian Flores. Sure, there were still some flaws in coverage in the secondary, but Minnesota's skill players under Flores, they played a lot more differently, in a good way, of course, than when they did under Ed Donatel. The defense was more hard-hitting, more aggressive. They were heavy on blitzing, so they really wanted to hit you in the face. So 2 players that stood out greatly from this was Byron Murphy, the new signee, and rookie linebacker Ivan Pace Jr. So Murphy was really good in coverage in the secondary, probably the one positive in that secondary. But it was Pace in the front seven, who's like a hydra, waiting in the wings with this fast tackling awareness. So just goes to show you that, hey, a change in defensive coordinator was what the Vikings really needed. And then when you look at back of the offense, Jordan Addison's rookie year was actually good for them because, yeah, at first it was difficult for him to net targets because, well, it was such a loaded offense with Justin Jefferson and then tight end TJ Hawkinson. But considering the circumstances that I'll be talking about in just a bit, Addison still managed to have a successful first season with a near 1,000-yard season and 10 touchdowns. And he actually was pretty good performance-wise as well. But next season should be really interesting. Next season will be a good test for him, considering that Justin Jefferson will be back healthy. And then once TJ Hawkinson enters back into the lineup as well, alongside whoever else they add, it should be interesting how that offense will roll with all those weapons. Unfortunately for the Vikings, things didn't go exactly as planned after that 3-4. After they got to the point of 3-4, because when they were playing the Packers in Week 8, disaster struck for Minnesota because, yes, they were riding the high of coming off an upset win over the 49ers at home on a Monday night. They go on a short week. They were pulling away from the Packers on the road. But then in the fourth quarter, Kirk Cousins suffers the dreaded injury that nobody wants to have, the torn Achilles, early in that fourth quarter. So this was actually his first major career injury. And, well, whether you were a Vikings fan or not, you knew it was the death nail in their season from there. So, yeah, Kirk Cousins was gone for the season, and they were forced to ride the quarterback carousel from that point onwards. It started with Jaren Hall, who got injured like 2 quarters in. Then it started with a brief tenure with traded Josh Dobbs from Arizona, who went on to play a couple of games. Then once he started underperforming, starting with that Denver game, they went to Nick Mullins, and then they went back to Jaren Hall, and then they went back to Nick Mullins. Interestingly enough, the Vikings were still in playoff contention for both, not just for a spot, but also for the NFC North despite this. And eventually, though, it came to a head when they faced the Detroit and unfortunately lost the division when they played them. So eventually, at some point, all these factors were going to come to a head. They just didn't have enough to compete, especially considering not just the Cousins injury that affected them. It was injuries to other players that really made things difficult. Because, they had these problems on both sides of the ball, but then when you lose your skill players, it just makes things even tougher. Because they were out without Justin Jefferson for most of the season. He didn't come back until week 15 when their playoff hopes were on life support. And then they went on to lose TJ Hawkinson in that first Detroit game in week 16. Yeah, week 16, I believe, to a torn ACL. And now it's looking likely that he's not going to be available to start the season because, again, it's a very late season injury for the Vikings. So probably not till halfway through this next season he's going to come back, if at all. And then key defensive player Jordan Hicks suffered a leg contusion. And then Marcus Davenport at edge rusher only played 6 games due to a high ankle sprain. So when you couple this with the inconsistent play to start the year for Minnesota, the Vikings were just buried even further once the injuries to all these key players started to pile on. So overall, I expected a step down from last season for the Vikings because, that quality of play was going to go down. But I didn't predict the inconsistency in the injuries to bury them, like to 7-10. It was just rough. It was just a rough year for Minnesota. They did manage to stay in the playoff fight until the very end by just a hairline, but it just still ended up being a disappointment of a season for Minnesota, which is unfortunate. It not by too much of fault of their own. But when you look at the Vikings offseason, at least they get a bit of a chance to rebuild themselves up. They have around $41 million in cap space, which is a good amount of money to spend. And they have the 11th overall pick. Now, does that mean they can go up and get a certain positional player? Probably not. But they can go and get whatever is best fit for them. Now, unfortunately, here comes the interesting question, because looking at some of the key free agents, they have some tough decisions to make. This team's going to look a little bit different going to 2024, and that starts at the quarterback position. Kirk Cousins. Let's talk about him a little bit after I get through this list. You also have to consider linebackers Anthony Barr and Jordan Hicks, edge rushers Markin Davenport and Daniel Hunter, and third down receiver KJ Osborne, the third receiver. So, some interesting key free agents when you look at the Minnesota Vikings. You can't keep them all unless they agree to team-friendly deals. So, some tough decisions are going to have to be made within the next couple of weeks. They did make an interesting move, though, and that was by releasing running back Alexander Madison, who vastly underperformed in a starting role once they released Dalvin Cook last offseason, which was an interesting move in of itself. So looking at some of their needs going into the start of the new league year, I don't know if it's happened by now, but what are they going to do at quarterback? Are you going to re-sign Kirk Cousins, or are you going to move on? The Vikings, they can't be making a single decision in free agency until they know what Kirk Cousins is going to do. They have to be considering, do they even want Kirk Cousins back? And yes, the injury was very unfortunate. The Achilles injury was very unfortunate. To be honest, he's played very solid for them. And maybe solid's not enough for them to keep him. But nonetheless, he has stabilized the offense to a degree. But now it's just a matter of question, do they believe it's time to move on? Do they believe they've reached their ceiling with them? Do the players believe that, do they want to keep Cousins, or do they want to go in a different direction? So even so, regardless, Cousins is not going to come cheap, despite coming off an injury. So if the Vikings want him back, they're going to have to convince him to return on a team-friendly deal. So once you figure out the quarterback position, you got to address the front four. Both Marcus Davenport and Danielle Hunter, as well as DJ Wonnum, they're all free agents. And, the interior was very bad this past season. So, Minnesota, I think you should re-sign Danielle Hunter and then figure out what to do at the defensive tackle position, sign someone new, and then find another edge rusher as well. Marcus Davenport was a big bust. Find an edge rusher in both free agency and the draft. And then you got to find a new starting running back. Replacing Dalvin Cook with Alexander Madison was a curious choice. Ended up being a big bust now. That's why Madison was released. Ty Chandler was good. Once he got the starting role, but you still have to address that position. Maybe have him compete for that starting spot again. So overall, you got to fix the running back position to help whoever's going to be at quarterback. Maybe they can do that in the draft. So overall, as I expected, it was a step down for the Minnesota Vikings in 2023, although not in the way people expected. So they have a tough quarterback decision nonetheless on its hands, and a decision that they have to make as soon as possible. Again, it hasn't been made at the time I'm talking about this, but it still has to be made before anything else. Resign Kirk Cousins, or take a chance on a young gun in the draft. Decisions in Minnesota. To wrap up part 2 of our 2023 NFL season recaps, let's go from up north of Minnesota to now down to the mile high of Denver to talk about the Denver Broncos. It was really curious to see how the 2023 Denver Broncos were going to do to follow up their disastrous first season of 2022 with Russell Wilson. To put it into context, Russell Wilson was signed and traded from the Seattle Seahawks to the Denver Broncos in the 2022 offseason 2 years ago. And then, let's just say that his first season as a Denver Bronco didn't exactly go the way that many people had hoped for. And especially with a head coach that doesn't know what he was doing with Nathaniel Hackett. So to try and further prevent Russell Wilson from getting roasted by Patrick Starr, yes, Patrick Starr from SpongeBob SquarePants even further, the team followed up their Christmas Day firing of Nathaniel Hackett with the hiring of former Saints head coach Sean Payton. But this also required a trade. a trade of two second round picks. Now, I was kind of weary of the hire and trade for Payne, considering he hadn't coached in a few years, but he at least brought a better offensive background than Hackett, and he could also help Wilson in a bounce back season. So for the Denver Broncos going into 2023, expectations were kind of high for Russell Wilson to bounce back, for Sean Payne to help Wilson in his bounce back, and for Denver overall to rebound from a horrible, very horrible 2022. Unfortunately, didn't get off that way. Pretty much more of the same, because they started off 0-3. They started off 0-3 to start the year. They actually started off their first two games a combined 3 points at home in the first two games against the Raiders and the Commanders. And against the Commanders, they blew a 21-3 halftime advantage. Like, how the hell do you do that? So anyway, this was all against in a prelude to what was to come in Miami in their first road game of the season. A 50-point ass whooping. A historical 50-point ass beating, where the Denver defense let the Dolphins score on every chance they could. Even from their backups, even from the Miami backups scored on the Denver starting defense. That's embarrassing. That's a fireable offense. And I was very surprised that nobody on that team got fired in that game. And I get it was early on in the season, but 50 points? 50 points in a game? Did you try? Did you try in that game? Now, sure, Russell Wilson had his fair share of mistakes, but he wasn't even that much of a detriment in half of Denver's poor start at 0-3 and eventually at 1-5, when his defense and even most of his offensive supporting cast couldn't even help him out. Was Sean Payne helping him out? I don't think so. So let's talk about that supporting cast. Half of that supporting cast was non-existent, and especially when you look at Jerry Jeudy. So the rushing committee of Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, Samaje Perine, they were serviceable, but not reliable enough to balance out the passing attack. And then when you look at the receiving game, outside of Cortland Sutton, there was no help for Wilson to go to. And yes, that includes, like I said, Jerry Jeudy. Because when you look at Jerry Jeudy, he's had his flashes. He looked really good a couple years back. But then, man, he has really disappointed in the last 2 years, in 2022 and 2023. And especially in a season where both he and Denver really needed each other, nowhere to be found. Especially in a year where most people had considered trading for him. Now, he has no value. And then when you look at later in the season, when the Broncos were winning all these games, they still managed to bench Russell Wilson. I mean, maybe Russell Wilson was one half of the catalyst of what ended up happening to Denver. He still played better than last season. He made smarter decisions with the ball. But again, despite all that, he still ended up getting benched in the final two games for Jarrett Stidham, the final two games of the season. Like, at the time, it's an odd decision by Sean Payne and the Broncos higher ups, but just like, that's kind of brutal. It's a brutal business, but it's like, shit, man. It's like for all Russell Wilson has done, like, yeah, it was good, but again, not good enough. But it's just like, well, that's shitty. So, looking at some of the positives for Denver's season, I mean, it's that 5-game winning streak that gave their season life. Like I said, Russell Wilson was one half of that catalyst for Denver's mid-season turnaround. But it was also because of their defense as well. But nonetheless, they started off 1-5, but then they really turned it around. They won 5 straight, and it wasn't a fluky 5-game winning streak. They beat the likes of the Packers, the Chiefs, the Bills, the Browns, and they were looking at one point like a sneaky playoff contender. And I was delusional enough to believe that they had an outside shot to steal away the AFC West from the Chiefs, who were struggling during that point of the season. Like, there was an outside shot of that actually happening. There was one point in the season where Denver was just 1 game back of the Chiefs, and yes, I was crazy enough to believe that they could actually steal away the division if they could hold it together. But unfortunately, they couldn't hold it together. They lost their last 4 of 6 in a reversion back to their old selves, including a very winnable game on Christmas Eve against the hapless New England Patriots in Bailey Zappi. Wilson really struggled in prime time. He reverted back to his old form, turned the ball over, which unfortunately led to his benching. So the Broncos ended their season 8-9. They pretty much stumbled to start the year. They had themselves a good mid-season stretch, but I guess not all good things last forever because, well, they all faltered. They all fell in prey, including Russell Wilson. And what also faltered was another chance at the postseason. Still haven't made it since that Super Bowl winning season with Peyton Manning. So, considering the manner that they benched Wilson, and all the details that followed, why they did it, well, the Broncos at the time had a decision on their hands, as the new league year was fast approaching. And when you look at their offseason, for the Broncos, they were in the red, around $19 million in the red, no money to spend, had some decisions to make, to get under the cap, under the money line, and they at least had a first-round pick, though, at number 12. So compared to the last 2 years where they had no first-round pick and barely any picks at all. So this is something, at least, right? So when you look at the key free agents, not really too many things to worry about, like K'Wan Williams at corner, kicker Will Lutz. Well, actually, you do need a kicker, though. And then another one at least key free agent is center Lloyd Cushenberry. Kind of a glue to that offensive line. So maybe consider re-signing him. But the one big move that they've already made, in relation to their entire 2 seasons overall, in what is already the big offseason move for the whole league overall, is, well, the Broncos, they've already cut ties with Russell Wilson. Yep, they already released his ass. They released Russell Wilson after making that big trade 2 years ago, after they gave up all those assets like Drew Lock, 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, Noah Fant, a tight end, to the Seattle Seahawks. Well, 2 years later, Russell Wilson in an $85 million dead cap hit, the largest ever in NFL history. Russell Wilson is gone. Finito. Gone from the Denver Broncos. Free to go wherever. Man, what an absolute disappointment for this team. Probably one now this is officially one of the worst trades in NFL history. This pretty much completes it. So, ouch. That's a big bill to swallow. That's a lot of money to swallow. Now, I don't even know if the Denver Broncos can do anything to do in free agency now. Now they have to swallow that shit. It's like $85 million plus on top of the $19 million in debt. Ouch. I mean, I don't understand the salary cap, but it's just like, still, $85 million in money in the red. Ouch. That's brutal. So anyway, if they're going to try to address their needs in the offseason despite a big amount of shit ton of money, Theo, well, you got to try and find your starting quarterback some way or another, because now you're going to be looking for a new quarterback. But unfortunately, your options are limited because you have no money. You barely have any draft capital. You can't move up in the draft board to get a quarterback unless one magically falls to you for one reason or another, because, well, of the shitty trades that cost them valuable draft picks. First, the Russell Wilson trade, and now Sean Payne. So now there also aren't many big names or any even bridge quarterbacks either in free agency, unless Kirk Cousins decides to magically go to Denver, move his family over there. But either way, Denver's quarterback position continues to be fucked. And, well, you got to find a way to fix your interior defensive line as well. The rushing defense for Denver was the worst in the league. They allowed a lot of rushing yards against anybody. So they need to use whatever resources they have, if they have any, to acquire at least 2 defensive tackles to shore up that front. good luck with that. And then you got to try to find some help at both corner and receiver. Because, yes, Patrick Surtain is a good corner, and Courtland Sutton is a good receiver, but they could use some help, some serious help. So drafting such for them is a must. So for the Denver Broncos, it looked like it was going to click for Sean Payne and Russell Wilson in 2023. And it did at times, but it just never got off that right foot. And it did midseason, but it fell apart in 2020 in the rest of the 2023 season. And unfortunately for them, they eventually learned that they got to eat the bad bullet that they shot at themselves. And what did it lead to? Releasing Russell Wilson and eating a $85 million bill in order to start fresh. Well, problem is, they also buried themselves deep to actually do such. And what did we learn from the Russell Wilson era in these last 2 years? I think it's summed up in 7 simple words. To put a proper end to the Russell Wilson era in this 2 years in this 2023 season, I think it's summed up officially in 7 simple words. That's not what he wanted to cook. And with that, that is the end of part 2 of our 2023 NFL season recaps. And in this episode, we talked about 6 teams. We talked about the Tennessee Titans, the Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears, the New York Jets, the Minnesota Vikings, and the Denver Broncos. So we have just wrapped up 12 teams in their 2023 seasons. So we got about 25 more to go. So 25 more, or no, 19 more to go. So sorry, I can't do math, but you get the point. We still have a lot more teams to go in our journey down to our March Madness here on Very Cold Lasagna. That is NFL Season Recap Month. But let me know your opinions. Let me know your takes on all the teams that I talk about. I'd love to know your opinions on my filthy casual DA in terms of your seasons, whether you're a fan of either of these teams, in the comments on YouTube, or send me a message on social media on Instagram or on Twitter at Very Cold Lasagna. So let's continue the conversation on either of those platforms in regards to all these 6 teams that I talked about in this episode. But for now, that is it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna, episode number 189 of this icy yet spicy sports podcast. And until the next one, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes on the world of sports. And as always, peace out.